One of the other issues that has been brewing all week is the war in Ukraine, the Russian war in Ukraine. Donald Trump, really reversing his policy, apparently, certainly his tune, when he said on Wednesday after meeting President Zelensky that actually Ukraine has every opportunity of taking all the land back, instead of telling them, as he did before, that they have to suck it up and lose a quarter of their territory. He said they could win this war, and by the way, the Russian economy is a paper tiger, to which, of course, Moscow said, no, it's not. We're doing just fine. And then I saw yesterday pictures on Instagram, I think, of very, very long queues of cars in Crimea lining up to get petrol. And what we sort of slightly missed, I think, in recent weeks is that the Ukrainians have become very good at targeting Russian infrastructure, especially around oil, which has had an impact on the economy. So the question is, could this be the thing that finally forces Putin to sue for peace? Because it certainly ain't the words of Donald J. Trump. Let's speak to Timothy Ash. He is an economist who's an associate fellow of the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. Good morning, Timothy.
Good morning.
How much trouble is the Russian economy in?
Well, things have been getting more difficult. I mean, people have often asked, why hasn't it collapsed? I mean, the weight of sanctions. And I put two factors there. Firstly, Putin knew this war was going to happen, right? I would argue that he's been preparing for it since 2014-15, annexation of Crimea. He built up lots of buffers, right? Huge reserve of foreign exchange, about $620 billion. They had a sovereign wealth fund as well. Yeah. They deleveraged, they reduced debt, they reduced their vulnerabilities. And secondly, we haven't done that much in terms of sanctions, right? We've been very slow. We've given the Russians lots of time to get around sanctions. We could have done lots more, right? But actually now, there's evidence that the buffers have been eroded. Things are getting a bit more difficult. Russia's having to make more difficult challenges. Inflation's been rising, growth's slowing, the budget deficit is getting bigger. And as you mentioned, the Ukrainians have been very clever, actually, in targeting a real vulnerability of the Russian economy, which is refined oil production. Refineries that produce petrol. And they've hit about 20% of refineries. They've taken out about 15% of refined production. They are causing shortages, which will make life, it will bring the war home to ordinary Russians. They haven't really experienced that so far, but now they are beginning to. And I think the longer the war goes on, the more we can do on the sanctions front. It means that Putin has to make some difficult choices, guns versus butter, essentially.
So, I mean, one of the other things, of course, is that they have been throwing butter, or rather money, at soldiers. So one thing I didn't realize, but I've also, come to realize, is that I think if you are a soldier, from an outlying part of Russia, I don't know, somewhere like Dagestan, you've got a really not great job, stuffing turkeys or picking turnips. You can earn $3,500 or the equivalent of by fighting for Russia on the front line in Ukraine. If you get killed, your family gets $65,000 as a payout, and there's a list of what you get paid for every limb that you lose. So for a lot of families, this is a real economic stimulus. I mean, obviously they're not hoping that their kids will die fighting the war, but I think we underestimate that, and I just wonder whether he's just running out of money to pay for his army.
Well, I think there's still a lot of durability there. I don't think, Russia's going to collapse any time soon. It's just making more difficult choices. It's interesting you mentioned the human cost of the war. I mean, probably 1 million casualties. Unfortunately, I mean, a lot of those casualties are borne by people in Russia's poorer areas. Yeah. Interestingly, a lot of them are the ethnic minorities, Muslim community in the south, not people in Moscow and St. Petersburg that politically probably counts. And Putin likes that, right? He's mopping up more challenging communities in the south of the country, putting him unfortunately into the meat grinder in Ukraine, etc. But look, the human and economic cost of this war will be enormous long term for Russia, right? But I think it's important at this point in time that there are vulnerabilities just beginning to show, and I think we do need to tighten up sanctions around Russia. There's lots of things we can do to just make more difficult choices for Putin.
So when Trump says, I will, make more weapons available for you, NATO, to buy, NATO in Europe, but you've also got to do your thing about not buying Russian oil and gas, he's right, isn't he?
Well, to be honest, Europe's done a lot in terms of reducing its vulnerability to Russian energy. Russian energy imports.
But who in Europe, right? The Germans have done it. The Italians to some extent, the French. But Hungary and Slovakia are very busy buying Russian oil and gas.
Well, the irony really is Putin and Trump's mates, Viktor Orban and Fico in Slovakia, are the ones still buying Russian energy.
Yeah.
And it gives Trump an excuse.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality, I think Trump doesn't want to do sanctions on Russia. He doesn't want to do anything particularly to harm Putin. We can debate why that is. But, the fact that the main importers of energy are Hungary and Slovakia, that eventually actually vetoes Trump's, the pressure on Trump to do anything. I mean, that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
But it is what it is. But there are lots of other things we can do. For example, there's immobilized Russian assets. We have about, just think in the UK, we have 25 billion quid of Russian taxpayer money sitting in our banks doing nothing. We have $330 billion worth of frozen Russian assets across Western jurisdictions. We can freeze that, seize it, use it for our own defense.
And why don't we?
We don't, because unfortunately there's a great big blob. There's there's a deep state, whatever you want to call it, that it's like a yes prime minister, yes minister, no. The UK Treasury, the ECB, they make all these excuses for not doing it.
Because it sets a precedent, or why?
No. I mean, look, there is that argument that in the end, confiscation will undermine the reserve currency status of sterling, of the euro, of dollar. Thing is, we immobilized 3.5 years ago. There was zero impact on sterling and the euro. The euro's actually been rallying with all this talk about immobilizing or freezing Russian assets. And actually, if you're worried about countries like China, Saudi Arabia moving their foreign exchange reserves out of the euro, the dollar and sterling, the reality is they have about $7 trillion worth of reserves. There's nowhere else for them to put the reserves. There are no alternative liquid markets. They don't trust each other. China's not going to buy Indian rupee, etc. So, in the end, look, this idea about the impact on the euro, I would argue if we don't do this, the risk is we don't fund Ukraine to win the war. It loses, and the impacts on the euro and Europe will be catastrophic. Yeah. Right. Just think of the UK, for example. I mean, we raided the aid budget to increase our defence spending by 0.3% of GDP. That 25 billion quid in our banks would have completely funded that. Yeah. It's idiotic that our politicians are happy to use our taxpayer money to fund the war in Ukraine, and they're defending Russian taxpayer money in our bank in the Western bank accounts.
That's beautifully put, and I couldn't agree more.